Hi there. I'll be doing something a little different today. I've been asked about what books I recommend from time to time, and I thought this topic deserved a video of its own. I won't do this in any particular order, but I will timestamp this, so if you want to jump to a particular book, then just take a look in the description box. Every once in a while, I'll read from the little notes I write into the books on occasion. Let's start, shall we? So, first book, Che, A Revolutionary Life by John Lee Anderson. Starting it off with something sweet. Honestly, this book is great. Che Guevara is a personal hero of mine, and this book really does the man justice. He was a monumental figure in an extraordinary time, and you can really feel it when you read this book. For me, when I think of people I look up to, it's always in an almost paternal way, if that makes sense. Marx and Lenin are seemingly old and bygone people, but Che feels almost like a brother, coupled with the fact that he was a physician by profession, as am I, and the closeness I feel is even more intense. The book is easy to read, it almost feels like an adventure, and is written in a beautiful amount of detail. Keep in mind it's over 700 pages long, so you'll definitely know Che's life by the end of it. If you're interested in socialist history, or the Cuban Revolution, or just the great man that he was, then check this book out. Alright, book number 2, Edward Said's Orientalism. This is an absolute must-read for all quote-unquote Orientals, particularly Muslims and those in the Middle East and Greater Middle East. It also is a must-read for those in the West, in my opinion, but of course the book is scholarly and the average person in the West may not have the necessary familiarity with Islam, the Middle East, and general colonial and imperialist attitudes towards quote-unquote Orientals. The book can be dull in parts, especially towards the beginning, but don't let that dissuade you from the sheer weight of his critique. He discusses how the Orient was Orientalized, how Western perceptions changed over time, and also how they've played into modern Western policy towards the Orient. He shows how the Orient itself was a Western invention, devoid of any real significance on the ground, as Western prejudices shaped Western perceptions of the Orient, and hence prevented any objective approach towards understanding the quote-unquote Orient, let alone communicating with it. He finishes it off with Orientalism today and its approaches. I honestly don't think you can make any valid analysis of anything regarding the Middle East without Said's profound analysis. Third book, Svetlana Alexievich, The Unwomanly Face of War. I would say that this is my favorite non-fiction book, alongside with Anderson's Che, A Revolutionary Life. This book details the lives of Soviet women during the Second World War through interviews. It shows everyday women, soldiers, doctors, engineers, nurses, technicians, housewives, partisans, and everything in between. I always knew that Nazis were absolutely horrible filth, but I didn't hate them as bitterly as I do until having read this book. Their brutality, lack of decency towards human life, their very nature comes out so clearly through the words of the women Alexievich interviews. If you're particularly squeamish about these sort of things, then maybe be a little cautious when reading the book, but I still recommend you read it. Sadly, the author is kind of a liberal. She calls Stefan Bandera, a literal fascist and war criminal, an independence figure in Ukraine. She also tries to insert her own petty musings way too frequently. Sometimes she drones on about herself, with no connection to the war or the women interviewed, completely negating the point of the book. If you can read through her nonsense, especially at the beginning of the book, then the real meat of the book, the interviews, are well worth it. Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. Yet another masterpiece in the same class as Said's Orientalism, in my opinion. A psychiatrist, or psychoanalyst, I can't exactly remember which, Fanon really shows the economic and psychological toll imperialism has on the colonized. He wrote this piece during the Algerian War of Independence, and hence discusses Algeria quite a bit. His attitude towards the connections between mental illness and colonialism is very interesting, and honestly is something that isn't discussed much, even till today. Chapters 3 and 4, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness and On National Culture, are the most profound parts of the book, and the most interesting is Chapter 5, Colonial War and Mental Disorders, in my opinion. It also helps that Fanon is a really talented writer, and has a great way with words. Said sadly didn't, and that's why Orientalism seems a little more dull. Sartre assumes the reader to be European in his preface to The Wretched of the Earth, and that irked me a bit, but the rest of the pretty great preface, as well as the stuff Fanon wrote, is fantastically excellent. I usually underline important bits of books I read for future reference, but at the end of the first chapter I wrote, if I were to underline the important, quote-unquote important parts of this book, I'd have to underline entire chapters. That was my honest feeling after having read just the first chapter. I cannot recommend this book enough. Shashi Tharoor's Inglorious Empire. Now, this is a brilliant book that basically talks about the British involvement in the Indian subcontinent and how horrible it was. The tagline says it best, what the British did to India. It talks about British motivations towards their occupation of India, their horrific way of extracting every last bit of wealth out of the region, and how Britain not only benefited, but also how the arguments used by those that favored the British occupation of India are absolutely wrong in every regard. I recommend this particularly if you're British or from the subcontinent. The downside is that the author, an Indian Hindu politician, tries to demonize Pakistan a bit towards the end, and it's a little transparent, and also a bit uncalled for. Otherwise, it's an excellent book. Remembering Che, My Life with Che Guevara by Aleida March. And another book about Guevara. Yes, a beautiful book, in fact, written by Guevara's fellow revolutionary and wife, Aleida March. This book has a biographical feeling, where March takes you through her life before she met Che and after. You get to see some lovely photos, get to read some of Che's poetry, and most importantly, get to know the man better. Not only as an idyllic revolutionary and worker, but as a poet, as a husband, as a father, and as a friend. You also get a bit of insight into the Cuban Revolution and people on the ground, since Aleida March herself was one of those people directly on the ground, moving between the city, the mountains and the plains, as the Cubans said, between the city and the countryside. Honestly, I don't know what to tell you. I really like Guevara. I have like 7 other books about him on my shelf. Maybe that'll be another video on its own in the future. Michael Parenti, Against Empire, and Black Shirts and Reds, 2 books. Parenti is one of the greatest political writers in the English language. In my opinion, he's like a better Chomsky. Against Empire is exactly that, Against Empire. He details what imperialism is, how it's carried out, the what and why of military interventions, particularly US military interventions, the facade that is American democracy, how the US government serves the interests of the rich at the expense of the poor, the presence of this stuff in academia, and real alternatives. He delivers this all in a well-sourced and easy-to-digest manner that practically anyone can understand. If you're a Marxist, though, and have been one for a while, then I don't think you'll get a lot more from this book. But still, read it if you get a hold of a copy. I think this is an excellent book for radicalizing liberals, or at least getting them to question the status quo more. The second book, Black Shirts and Reds, is another matter altogether. This is a must-read for all socialists. Scratch that, everybody should read this book. It details how fascism has been used to secure the interests of large capitalists against the demands of popular democracy, how revolutions bring about a dramatic reduction in political and economic oppression. It critiques left anti-communism really well, I might add. It talks about the issues with previous socialist governments, talks about class, free market policies in the Far East, and so much more. An absolute masterpiece. Get it, read it, and hand it out to everyone around you. It's that good. Huey P. Newton, Revolutionary Suicide. Newton's excellent way of writing is very moving. As someone who has never been to the US, this gave me a glimpse into the life and hardships of an African American in the United States. Doubly so because Newton was an incredibly intelligent and thought-provoking person that questioned what happened around him, and was punished by the system for doing so. Reading this, I began to understand how race relations in the US have not changed much, particularly when it comes to the police. The book talks about Huey Newton's life, mixed in with his personal outlook. The time he spent in prison and his visit to China are my personal favorite parts of the book. Read this in series with other books on the Black Panthers and you'll understand their popularity, why the capitalist state crushed them, and why we need their sort of militancy and form of organizing today. Not only in the United States, but all across the world, really. Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. This is by far the easiest book to read on this list, in my opinion. The book flows from point to point in the author's life as a so-called economic hitman. The stuff in it may be particularly profound for the average liberal, but it's nothing new for the average Marxist. Perkins suffers from the usual corporatism nonsense, and the book is pretty American-centric, but keep in mind that it was most likely intended for an American audience. This is the sort of book that pushes people to become critical of US foreign policy, and that could cause a drift to the left for some people. I doubt they would end up as Marxists, but give it to your parents or coworkers, it definitely helps. The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould. A beautiful book, disproving the bell curve nonsense and other racist pseudoscientific stuff, delving into its history and being very academic and all that. I find this book very easy to read, and the contents are honestly what any decent human being already thought, but it might seem boring to some. There's extensive quoting of sources older than 100 years, there's lots of talking about meddling statistics, etc, etc. I'm actually going to make a video based on this book, so read it or not, you can always just watch the video. Finally, prepare for double trouble. Well, more like triple trouble. Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Well, not only that. Also, Lenin's Imperialism in the 21st Century by the Manila Institute of Political Economy, and Imperialism in the 21st Century by John Smith. Why all three? Well, everyone needs to understand the phenomenon of imperialism. Knowing what it is clears up so much of the noise regarding foreign and domestic policy, particularly in the current centers of imperialism, the US and Western Europe. It becomes less about what politicians say and about the real concrete consequences both at home and abroad. European involvement in Africa, American military inventions, IMF loans, and so much more starts to make sense, as a capitalist tool used to secure markets, maintain and grow the wealth of capitalists, as well as the consequences for labor movements, human rights, etc, etc. Now, in order to understand imperialism, though, and to get a look into the history, you should read Lenin himself. In my opinion, alongside with State and the Revolution, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, is his greatest work. All his work is his greatest work to me. After that, the Manila Institute's take on imperialism in the 21st century is very easy to digest and gives you an overview of how imperialism has morphed in the 21st century. Finally, John Smith's book is the most data-heavy, and maybe also the most boring to some, but it's pretty good. I honestly can't do these three works justice. Read them, please. And that's it. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. I'd also like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Zarian Arsen, Xiaoyan Zhang, Oren Clark, Larry Valdemar Miniailo, Khan, Daryl McFarlane, Comrade Pingu, and of course, Charles. Thank you, Charles. That'd be all for this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Let me know if you want more book recommendations or whatever. I'm always up. See ya.